Okay. I believe we are live. Welcome, everybody, to the third installment of Newly Elected and So Much to Do, our conversation with those who have recently come into elected office representing our neighborhood here in Reservoir Hill. I had the opportunity to speak with then incoming Mayor Brandon Scott and with current Congressman Kwesi Mfome. And it's now my great honor and pleasure to speak with James Torrence, the councilman for this 7th district. I'll say a word about Councilman Torrence in a moment by way of introduction, but I also want to make sure that you know that we at Bethlehem Synagogue are doing this program, this series, in partnership with several other community stakeholders here in Reservoir Hill. And that would be with the Reservoir Hill Improvement Council, with the St. Francis Neighborhood Center, the Upper Utah Madison Neighborhood Association, and Men of the Hill, and also IFO, which is Betham's sister nonprofit in for of, which strives to foster and create Reservoir Hill relationships. Really, really grateful to be here with Councilman James Torrence. A word about the councilman. He's a Baltimore native raised in public housing. He taught civic engagement for the YMCA's youth development programs and mentored students while he completed his undergraduate studies at Towson University. He was a fellow at City Hall and assisted in cleaner, greener Baltimore efforts, and also single stream recycling, which maybe you can tell us if that will be coming back anytime soon to our neighborhood. And also the Adopt a Lot program in Baltimore. In 2010, he was a legislative aide and interim chief of staff to former State Senator Verna Jones Rodwell. He worked for in 2012 for the Baltimore City Public Schools as a CEO graduate fellow, performing classroom-sized research and aiding in the principal selection process. And in 2015, he worked for the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, supporting investigations in securities and communications industries. Councilman Torrence, welcome. So glad to have. Do we lose the councilman? Uh-oh.
Yes, I think he said he just got kicked off. He's trying to log back in now.
Got it. We will wait a second for him to return. Councilman, I apologize. I'm not sure. At one point I lost you, but I said all these nice things about you, so I hope you heard some of them.
I heard most of it. My internet went boop. So
I feel you. Well, anyway, first of all, I really just want to welcome you and thank you for joining me in conversation this evening, particularly after the week and the day we had yesterday. I know this is not an easy time. I also want to thank you for dressing much better than I have this evening. So clearly, I feel a little underprepared, but the fact that you have a jacket and a tie hopefully will compensate, and we'll pretend like you're wearing a jacket with no tie and I'm wearing a shirt and tie with no jacket. Fair enough?
Fair enough. I mean, I have not had an opportunity to put on a suit and jacket as often this year. This year and last year. So I took the opportunity.
Well, it's really an honor to be with you. I think what I'd like to do is begin with a quote that I actually shared when I interviewed Mayor Scott. And it's a quote from our Jewish tradition from a 3rd century text called Pirkei Avot. And it is the following. Rabbi Hanina, the vice high priest, said, "Pray for the welfare of the government, for were it not for the fear it inspires, each person would swallow their neighbor alive." When I shared that with the mayor, at the time, I was thinking about a lot of kind of insecurity that we are feeling in the country right now. I was thinking about the challenge of an increased lack of confidence in government. And I was not anticipating at the time what happened yesterday at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. I want to begin by just giving you the opportunity to reflect a little bit on your experience of yesterday. How are you feeling? What would you like to tell your constituents here in Reservoir Hill and members of Beth Am Synagogue about what you feel either you learned, were surprised, were not surprised by yesterday, and just any reflections on what the implications are for you in your role as a city councilman?
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for having this opportunity. But when I think about it, I'm I'm hurt, and I say that because I'm not surprised it happened, but what I'm surprised is to the extent in which it happened. Formerly worked on Capitol Hill, so I understand the security parameters are in accessing the hill. The reason why we had a visitor center, the reason why we had staff badges, there are tunnels, and to think about the fact that this was an occupation of government and based off of clear lies. And it's steeped in the ego of one person, but also steeped in the flames of racism, anti-Semitism, and just pure against others. And for me, it's about thinking about how can we not only acknowledge it, but grow from it. I'm a former political science major, went to law school, clearly understand electoral college, but thinking about how do we empower people? Because often we see the levers as a federal government, but we have to think about how policies and laws are implemented on the state and local level. And as a council person, I think about my own approach to governing. My own approach is governed by racial equity and thinking about intersectionality and how we address the needs of everyone and be mindful of not only our past, but also our present. And thinking about that, it was persons who embody the things from yesterday who fulfilled policy changes 20, 30 years ago that were race neutral that still impact people in Baltimore today. And for me, in thinking about with my class, one of the questions we've always asked is how do we undo structural racism in city government? How neighborhoods are treated differently, how communities are valued, how do we spur development beyond just our regular corridors or our downtown corridors or certain neighborhoods, how we address the needs of people in the Black butterfly, how do we do meaningful change for people that see that people care about them. And that lack of trust in government has been there for years. It's been seeping because of just the tribalism that we have. Even on a local level, we've had some tribalism, but it's about serving everyone no matter what. And I just ask that people think about, am I serving my neighbors any better today? Am I supporting my neighbors? Am I checking on my neighbors today? And that's what I worry about, because it is ultimately the communities that we live in our small local areas, and especially in Reservoir Hill, it's how we move forward. How do we help our neighbors? And it's that micro, and then it then impacts the macro.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, for my part, I was dismayed and horrified, but not all that surprised by what happened. I think we've seen the trajectory of the Trump administration and the way in which not only stoking fears, but inciting violence has been, just part of the administration. And so the lack of preparedness by the police, the way in which those who converged on the Capitol in this insurrection, this attempted coup d'etat, were treated so much differently than I suspect, and I think a lot of people suspect they would have been if they were Black, if they were brown, right, of Arab descent, if they were carrying Black Lives Matter banners, if they were saying words in Arabic, right? So I'm curious. I feel on one hand that I, as a person with white skin privilege, need to, in this moment, join other white people and really sort of assessing the impact of white supremacy and the legacy of white supremacy in this country. I'm curious if you have any reflections on some of the images that you saw, somebody pulling down an American flag and putting up a Trump flag in its place, the Confederate flag in the rotunda, or just the kind of the inequitable response. You spoke about equity. That I think these domestic terrorists met as opposed to other folks.
So I think about the contrast between the Black Lives Matter protests and the preparedness of District of Columbia. I think about the fact that a request was made by our mayor to the Department of Defense, and no one, and they denied it, to activate the National Guard immediately to help with the Capitol Police Department. Or the fact that the governors of both Maryland and Virginia sent state troopers and activated their guard to support a mayor who was in desperate need at that time. Or the fact that the residents I think people need to think about the trajectory, or like just think about where Capitol Hill is. Capitol Hill is close to Anacostia, which is a majority Black portion of Washington, D.C. Imagine the fact that people are spouting white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and they're entering your community. You're on lockdown, not the persons who are violating not only our capital, but your community at the same time. Or the fact that they went back to hotels, where if you think about the irony is that Senator-elect Warnock from Georgia was arrested for a peaceful protest and prayer in the actual hall and rotunda for praying that Congress would not end the Affordable Care Act. And we're just 3 years removed from it. And he was arrested. Whereas persons who had pipe bombs, who were trying to assault officers, entered a building, desecrated the Speaker of the House's desk, stood on the Senate floor. And it's just to the point where we have to reevaluate where we are as a country. And I ask allies to just talk to your family members, help them understand that like the conspiracy theories that are being spread are false, and allow them to understand the impact that they're having on simply just relations in this country. And the fact that we are losing communities because we're not recognizing that the basic human rights, or thinking about the Poor People's Campaign. There was always an issue where white supremacy has never been addressed because of the economic straits it puts on poor white communities or communities of color. We have to start thinking about how do we change the trajectory of our most vulnerable populations.
It's well said. I'm curious if you have a reflection on specifically the role of local government, just given what we witnessed yesterday. Did that help concretize for you any thoughts about the importance of local government? Is there a way that we should be differently focused on the work of, for example, the city council or perhaps the General Assembly in Annapolis and its relationship to our city here in Baltimore versus the current sort of spectacle of federal politics?
I'll start on the local level. I think in the local level, the 7th District is diverse. It starts at Mount Royal Terrace and North Avenue and goes as far west as Mount Holly and Fairmount Park. So every piece of North Avenue west of 83 is in the 7th District. The 7th District ends across the street from Poly and Western and Medfield and Holtz Heights. Holtz Heights used to be a majority Black community. And then I have a portion of Hamden that has been working class. And we're thinking about, on a local level, it's not about simply just thinking about the national aspect of what race relations are, but it's thinking about addressing human needs, and it's about human rights. And I think that's where local politics has to be focused on, basic human rights. How do we make sure that Black communities aren't paying more in property taxes? How do we make sure that we have investment in Black communities as well as white communities? How do we make sure that we end food deserts? How do we address our returning citizens who are disproportionately the largest number of persons who are murdered in the city or involved in the most violent crimes in our city? We're going back. We have to go back to the common denominator is humanity. How do we look at two persons' humanity, and how do we assert that humanity in our policy work at the local level? And how we make sure our elected officials are accountable to just that humanity. In terms of the state, we have to make sure that people no longer view Baltimore as just a place where you're just dumping money into. It's not that. because without Baltimore's port, the state would not have an economy. We have to start talking about the strengths of Baltimore. The strengths are that Baltimore is the heart of this state. It is the engine to this state. We need to get as much as we deserve in terms of how we add to the state's economy, and that the people here deserve more and need to be recognized for their humanity. And that's where we have to talk to our state partners about how do we bring funds back there? How do we make sure our schools no longer look like prisons? How do we make sure our students are getting wraparound services? How do we make sure our seniors have supports beyond just having healthcare? Or how do we make sure that our seniors can age in place? How do we bolster home ownership in our neighborhoods? How do we make sure things are affordable for home ownership? How do we make sure that we address the needs to make sure that people can walk safely down the street?
So let me ask you about some of your priorities. But before I do, I want to invite people who are following along on our YouTube channel. If you have questions yourself, you're welcome to put those questions in the chat. I see a couple of people already have done so, and I'll try to get to them. I may switch off a little bit tonight and add some questions from the chat and then come back to some of my own. But if you would like to ask a question of Councilman Torrence, this is your opportunity to do so, and we will do our best to convey that question to him. But my question for you is, what are your priorities, your legislative agenda, and especially if you could tell us about the kinds of things you're working on that you feel are related to us here in Reservoir Hill, especially in Central West Baltimore.
Yeah, so for me, I think when I think about Central West Baltimore, near and dear to my story, it's about the fact that my parents were returning citizens. So I think about two things: education, because neither one of them had a high school diploma. I think about also the fact is that they need that returning citizens in this district need the services. The majority of the persons returning to Baltimore from incarceration are returning to the 7th Council District, disproportionately. So how do we ensure wraparound services that get you access to adult education programs, access to employment, access to housing? How do we minimize or get rid of social determinants that lead you back to a life of crime or a life that you no longer want to be a part of? How do we make sure you're productive? When my mom returned from prison, she became mom again. So how do we help you navigate that socially and emotionally? They get you access to adult education program. So how do we get you to, one, be able to be that human person again? And I think about that. And then I think about how do we do equitable development in Baltimore? And one of the things I'm doing is working with a colleague on that as well. Thinking about how do we create a land bank in our city? How do we make sure that we are using our land use properly so that we can build a better Baltimore and do equity in terms of how we build communities back and make investments? Also thinking about the fact that there are dangerous corners in the 7th District. I can go from Park in North Avenue to Gwynn Falls and Arkansas, Gwynn Falls and Garrison, and then between there, Gwynn Falls and Reisterstown Road. I can tell you around Park Circle. I can tell you there are areas in the district where you come off of 83 into Hamden, people are speeding by and crashing into cars, and thinking about how do we change and make sure that our communities are safe. Like, I'm encouraged by the calming that you guys did at Whitelock and Brookfield. It makes people more mindful. It makes people think about where they're going. And the other thing is that one of the things I've learned about attracting families into this district, there aren't enough playgrounds. So how do we build playgrounds back into our community and make spaces for families that want to live here?
Yeah, and I appreciate that about playgrounds. That was our family's first big project when we moved to the neighborhood, was collaborating with the neighborhood to build German Park Playground. My wife was the co-chair of that, and very proud of that project and really grateful that it now falls under the auspices of Rec and Park, so that we no longer have to fight to get trash picked up or to get equipment repaired and those kinds of things. Let me push a little bit on this question of equity that you've raised a couple of times, and equitable development you mentioned. You talked about I think it was, did you say land trust was the term you used?
Land bank. It's
Land banks. So maybe you could explain what that is for people who may not know. And also I have a question here from Thomas Cujo, who's a neighbor and a friend from Men of the Hill, who asked specifically, what concrete efforts will you lead to advance equity in our district?
Definitely. So one of the things in terms of leading in terms of equity, it's twofold. One is ensuring that we have this land bank is central to that, because one of the things is that often a large number of the neighborhoods in the 7th district were redlined. So for me, figuring out how the city can, with a land bank, which is an authority that allows us to sell, repurpose, acquire, and renovate land use in the city, drive development so we can end speculation in some of our communities, how we can bolster home ownership. One of the things I'm worried about is that some of our communities, especially in Reservoir Hill, it's 36% home ownership. How do we increase home ownership in your communities and increase the tax base so that we can then make sure that we have more services, more programming, better recreation, better health programs in our city? So when I think about equity, I think about how do we create avenues to actually create development that works for communities, but respects the needs of the community. In other cities, land banks use RFP process. So they'll put out an RFP, they get the advice of the community that they were looking to have the development in. Some community have identified needs that they have in their community that they want developers or the person responding to that RFP to address. So imagine having in a RFP, which is a proposal and a requirement that you need something in your community and they have to address it. And we're just not allowing people to acquire property. The other piece is that, again, back to returning citizens, we need to create, one of the tangible things is creating a system and getting federal funding for an office of returning citizens, and thinking about how do we do a lot of the work around it is about just case management. There's organizations in the 7th district that do not have the capacity for case management. There's also the fact is that we have 2 officers in the Baltimore City Police Department that are behind the walls and talking to people about how do you reintegrate into the community. And often one of the things is that how truthful will you be with a police officer if you're going to say that I don't know if I have housing, when housing is a requirement of your actual release, or the fact, or advocating to make sure that we need to start ending some of these parole fees. Like a person who does not have employment should not pay you $50 a month just to be supervised. Or a person who owes child support should not have to pay child support while in prison because they no longer have the access to actually make that actual payment. Or thinking about, one is thinking about there are schools in our district that desperately need wraparound services. How do we bolster those and advocate for those programs? One of the things is that where my office is planning to help with is that though the plastic bag ban was delayed, we're working on getting reusable bags to distribute in our food deserts. That's a part of equity, because we know that like the persons who are going to get hit the hardest, who have to travel the furthest to get food, are going to need those plastic bags. And if you're paying 5 cents for a paper bag, we need to figure out ways to help you. Especially, I grew up with modest means. That 5 cents, and depending on what the paper bag looks like, can easily be $5. And that could be one meal that you put back. So how do we end those things? Those are some of the tangible things I'm working on, as well as looking at how we do our transit around the city. I'm very concerned about the accidents that are happening at these corners. I'm also concerned about how do we make sure that the park at Druid Hill Park is completed properly, that we get the amphitheater, that we get the kayaking, how we also make sure that the areas around Druid Hill Park do not look like a highway, and how they're more accessible, especially looking at if we can get municipal businesses in the actual park and think about how we can think differently about the park and programming.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many questions about what you said, and I'll try to take them one at a time and also incorporate some of these other questions from folks in the chat. But exploring more of this question of equity in neighborhood development, right? In home ownership rates, you mentioned. Also, you know, I in my 10 and a half years in the neighborhood, I've seen a lot of change, and much of it has been good change, right? Fewer vacant houses, safer conditions generally for families to really nice playgrounds in the neighborhood now. And we moved to the neighborhood, there were none. You know, certainly it's cleaner and greener. The Whitelock Community Farm has been a great boon. The Dovecote Cafe has added a lot of vitality to the neighborhood. There are good things. And yet, at the same time, some of those kinds of things come along with gentrification and displacement of Black and brown families. I'm curious if you could speak to the question of how do we arrive at continued improvement, both in Reservoir Hill, but also to sister neighborhoods that are greener and safer and cleaner, and also avoid skyrocketing tax rates that displace families, and make it less of a diverse community, both racially and economically.
So that's the conversations we're having with our colleagues about legacy residents, especially in the 7th district. The large portion of the homeowners who are actually upholding our property taxes are above the age of 50. So one of the things, that's why I talk about how do you age in place? How do we make sure that we're not hindering you or hurting you? Because I have a gentleman from Hamden who told me that a good $600 of his Social Security check goes just to property taxes. So these are the questions that some of our committees are going to start answering and trying to figure out how we answer, because we recognize that a large portion of the persons who are homeowners in Baltimore are seniors. And when they bought their home, it was for far less. They're in communities where there was no way that we could put a trust in place right away to actually protect their rates, or looking at how do we do specialized rates for seniors. These are things and questions that are being addressed and asked by members of my class, such as Odette Ramos and myself, and figuring out how we can do it that way, or how do we do it without not hurting the bottom line of the city, but also address the needs of those persons, or looking at how do we not only look for mixed use for affordability and make sure that communities remain diverse.
Let me ask about equity and the pandemic. We're now almost at a year of the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't have to tell you about the impact, both in terms of loss of life and also the health disparities that the pandemic has laid bare, ones that we knew existed, but are once again kind of just made clearer than day when you look at the numbers of folks in poorer and browner communities who are suffering disproportionately the effects of COVID-19. As the vaccine is rolled out, I'm curious what you're hearing in city government about the disbursement of vaccines and how will they be distributed quickly but also equitably.
I'm sounding an alarm. So I'm going to be real blunt about what I've said in meetings, even with some of our hospitals, and advocating for the fact that I'm strongly advocating that we have a vaccine location in the 7th district. I'm strongly pushing that it be close to Mondawmin or at Mondawmin, because when we look at the numbers in terms of just the rate of COVID-19 impacting in the cases, the 7th district has a portion of 21215, which is an older population, which is adjacent to Mondawmin. So how do we address it in an equitable way, especially think about transportation? We think about the fact that one drug requires complex cooling, one drug does not, and it lasts longer out for a shelf outside of cooling. So we have to think about how do we do effective distribution. So I'm advocating for an actual vaccination location in the 7th district, similar to the testing that they had at Mondawmin and at BCCC in the district. I'm a firm believer that we need it, but also thinking about it that we need to start thinking about looking at the data for our food sustainability, and how before the pandemic hit, there was questions about using grants to actually allow people to corner store owners that have refrigeration and shelving for fresh produce. So my question back ahead is, how do we connect them with local distributors so that they can provide those things and allow them to collect TANF benefits or EBT or a pandemic EBT, or addressing the food insecurity of our seniors, because this is hit heavy and people are making those decisions. Or the fact that also thinking about how do we make sure and support the school system in terms of right now they're paying for people's internet, and how do we bolster that from the city government perspective of it?
I want to ask a question from the chat. I have a question from Ben, who's a Bethon member. What is the councilman's agenda with respect to police funding and police accountability?
So for me, my agenda is clear. Is accountability is clear to it. It's like looking at the numbers. One is that this year, because of the census, we're going to redistribute our districts. So the question is, how do we make sure that that distribution does not leave some communities vulnerable? And some, like I've received emails from persons in Reservoir Hill about how do we have more foot patrols, more presence of officers, and thinking about it. The other piece is thinking about it is how do we support the reforms that are happening in Annapolis? And that's realistic because right now, Baltimore City's police department is a state agency. So how do we support that and make sure those reforms are realistic for the city of Baltimore? On top of that, how do we really sit down and have conversations about things that we can and look at the police department and say, how can we have you be sustainable on grants from the federal government while we distribute funds elsewhere? These are the conversations that we have to, but look at it in a meaningful way about how we distribute those funds.
Let me ask you about, since you brought up local control, I will say that's an issue that I've been involved with. We have a neighbor here who's pretty well known in the police reform community, Ray Kelly, who has advocated for local control. I know the mayor has advocated for local control. I'll be honest with you, we have had some trouble with our local delegates and senator just sort of getting it done at the state level. And I'm curious if in your conversations you feel like whatever concerns have been raised in the past have been satisfied and our city delegation in Annapolis is ready to return control to Baltimore City of its own police department because it is long past due.
So this is where I'm cautious. I'm cautiously optimistic because not everyone who's drafting the control bill is coming from Baltimore City. So again, it goes back to that agency for the city and what we want to have. But also,
I will just say that 2 years ago, it was absolutely the city delegation that was hesitant to move forward with this. And part of, I think, their hesitancy was a lack of trust in city council and city government. And I'm curious if you feel like that's developed or matured. I was really disappointed to hear that kind of a response in those days. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine. I haven't heard those. I haven't heard that from anyone in the delegation. What I am cautious and optimistic that we can get this done. I think that those conversations have to be more detailed about, one, the state statutes that this impacts. Also foreshadowing the fact that there is a push to do more police reform on the state level. And what does that look like? I'm a policy person, so I want to see what that bill looks like, what those hearings look like, and what do those minutes look like. Because one of the things is that thinking about what does control look like? What is the authority that either the mayor or the city council has? And just fleshing that out is one of the things that I'm more so concerned about. What are the I call it the stopgaps, because there are certain things that political people cannot do in certain instances. So what are those things that people put in place to build that trust? Those are the questions I have in the forefront of my head, but also understanding that this is a need. We should have policy control. I think that we should be able to say that we're banning chokeholds in Baltimore City, or that we're changing the practices, or we're trying to figure out ways to do staffing differently.
And I have a follow-up from Ben on that, who just asked, do you support the 5 state-level reforms from the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a simple yes. So here's the thing. I can tell you that in 2015, I was a legal observer for the unrest. So I understand, and then understand from the fact when I was in law school, we actually assisted professors in looking at the general orders for the police department, and there were training issues and errors. So when it comes down to local control, how do we change training, and how do we afford those training changes too? So I'm optimistic because my nuts and bolts and deepness into what I've learned, not only as a private citizen, is about how do we get it done, and where do we have that agenda where it goes.
I have a question here from a neighbor, Tony, who says, I'm going to lose my housing because property taxes are too high for my landlord to afford because she's retired. I want to kind of put her concern to you, and also maybe ask broadly about eviction rates and rentership here in Baltimore City. Baltimore City has one of the highest eviction rates, as you know, in the United States, like 5.3%, and they disproportionately impact Black female-headed households who have an eviction rate of over 7%. I know this is this is an issue that is personal to you. I'm curious if you can speak both to Tony's concerns and to the broader concern, and especially speaking about the renters' right to counsel that was just passed in the previous city council. But I've heard that there are some real concerns right now about funding and whether or not they'll be able to fund that mandate.
So one, Tony, please email my office to see how we can assist you with housing. This is near and dear to me as a person because I was homeless once. So I understand the fear of losing your home, but also thinking about the fact is that this is where, again, we go back to how do we spread the property taxes across multiple, more than just the persons who are our legacy. This goes back to the idea of legacy homeowners and how properties are assessed, because the assessment system in Maryland does have some issues, and the valuation, I can tell you from my own personal story, my assessment of my home went up $2,500 in 1 year. And luckily I can afford that. But the fact that because of the neighborhood I live in, which is predominantly that Black, I have neighbors who are paying $9,000 in property taxes, and they're seniors. So it's constantly at the forefront of my head of like, how do we address this in an equitable way? But also the fact is that I support the rights of counsel. It was one of the things that I told Jews United for Justice, that it's one of the things I really, it's clear. The ABLE report and the other reports about how it saves us money is where we need to think about it. It's about the investment. I'm a person that if the investment makes sense and it saves us money down in the long term, it's worth it. So trust me, I'm an advocate for making sure we get this funded.
And looking for win-wins, it sounds like, which is
it's a way to get win-wins. Even with the fact that our office has received communications from persons about the eviction protection prevention fund that landlords can actually apply on behalf for their actual residents. That's one of the things that we're going to communicate and just talk about with Tony is like, your landlord can apply to get the assistance so that they don't have to evict people or have to raise rent. And then there's some people who are actually thinking about how do we make sure that we make it affordable or the funding for it. We're not going to get out of COVID-19 within the next 6 months. This is more likely a year or two.
Let me ask about neighbor development. You mentioned your neighborhood. I believe you live in Ashburton, right?
Yes.
And which is a lovely community. But I live here in Reservoir Hill, and this conversation is largely focused on Reservoir Hill concerns. And so I'm just curious if we could talk a little bit about some of the upcoming neighborhood development here in Reservoir Hill. There are two big projects happening, as you know. One on North Avenue, the redevelopment of Madison Park North, and also the redevelopment of the vacant lots on Druid Park Lake Drive. There's also the development of Druid Park Lake Drive itself, which after the lake reservoir project is completed is supposed to be a different sort of road, hopefully one with better connectivity, walking and cycle and wheelchair access. If you could say something about how those things are shaping up and your thoughts about what are the best kinds of developments to see in a neighborhood like ours.
So I try not to say what is the best type of development in someone's neighborhood. I think I will tell you personally, I'm an advocate for transit-oriented development. I like having density next to major modes of transportation because I understand the impact that it has on employment and livelihood of persons, as well as the fact that we live in food deserts. I'm excited about the Madison Park North development because the homes being added adds to the equations that people use to create food stores and markets. So that will bring and address the needs of the food desert within the 7th district. in terms of the density that's going to be created by the Druid Lake Drive development. I'm excited about that as well. I'm more concerned about how do we make sure that DOT, Parks and Recs, and Transportation are at the table and discussing the re-envisioning and the process of not only our park, but also Druid Lake Drive. One of the things that we're hosting, we're working with DPW on, is making sure that you have an information session on where the progress is for Druid Lake Drive in terms of the development, as well as the park in terms of the reservoirs, then the tanks. The reason why is that we saw the emails about Linden and people driving down Linden. We've heard the emails about the plate that's been coming that came up. We're concerned about making sure that there are connectivity from each one of your corners into the park. Some of the plans that I've seen about the access to the park looks less like a highway. And I'm excited about the access that they're creating, but making sure that 3 agencies are talking to each other and making sure that they don't muck this up.
Yeah,
and that
talking to each other and bought into the same basic principles and vision, right?
Bought into the same basic principles and vision, and also discussing the fact is that there were promises made to your community about having an actual amphitheater. One of the questions I'm waiting to hear back, because I want the park to continue to host the African American Heritage Festival, is seeing like, could that area that they're going to create into green space above those tanks support having the festival at the front of the park?
Yeah, I mean,
and not in the fishbowl. Right. I think it's welcoming. I think it's more diverse. I think it creates a welcoming environment for the park. Also, the fact is they're creating the paths. They're gating off the reservoir again, so that if you do want to have some type of party or some type of festival, they're not restricted, or they don't have to put up restrictions.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more neighborhood development question. This is a question that comes from Laura, who is the chair of RAT, the Residents Against the Tunnels, and that's about the BNP Tunnel project. I also asked the mayor about this, and actually the congressman. I assume you're familiar with the project. There are a number of folks in the community who have real concerns about the BNP Tunnel project, about putting a multi-story vent shaft on North Avenue across the street from Dorothy I. Heights School that would be spewing particulates from diesel engines up. There's also been a real lack of transparency around this project, where community conversations have really been focused on Amtrak, but if you really pay attention, it seems this is being driven by the freight company. So you mentioned the port. Obviously, the port's important. Obviously, we want to have commerce and we want to have shipping in Baltimore City, but there are some real concerns in this neighborhood and also in other West Baltimore neighborhoods. You mentioned the Black Butterfly. The current trajectory for the path of the BNP Tunnel goes under that left wing of Black Butterfly. I couldn't hear what you said. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about equity and what it would mean potentially to bring hazardous materials under much of Black West Baltimore.
So a lot of my background is from years ago was environmental justice. So I think about the environmental impact statement that was released. I think about the fact that my in-laws live in Reservoir Hill. I think about the fact that 100% loss, and I'm trying to say this in the nicest way, but I'm just going to say it.
You don't have to be. It's just the two of us. So, I'm
going to be realistic. You should not have to deal with the loss of 100% of your property before being reimbursed. I've seen no federal funding being allocated to this, and I prayerfully think that it will die and stay dead. But the other question is that this doesn't work if you're going to destroy homes and communities, or the fact that there's a brand new school there, and the fact that the storm drainage that the school created to help with mitigation of stormwater in the community is important. So imagine the impact that could have. This could have some drastic impacts on the floodplain of just North Avenue alone. So I'm thinking of it. It's at the forefront. I understand if the neighborhood's against it, and I'll stand with you.
Great. It's good to hear. Let me go back to one of my questions for a moment. As you know, we've had a chance to be in conversation multiple times, and I'm really enjoying getting to know you. We've had conversations about Druid Hill Park. Obviously, Beth Am Synagogue is a synagogue. It's a Jewish community institution, and it's one that has been a synagogue for nearly 100 years, though Beth Am itself was established in a historic synagogue building about 47 years ago. We really strive to be in, for, and of our neighborhood here in Reservoir Hill. And so we think about how we can create a linkage and an alliance between the concerns of our own community, Jewish members who live here in Reservoir Hill and beyond, and folks who are not Jewish who live in the neighborhood, who look to our congregation as an anchor institution in the neighborhood. What does it mean to be an effective anchor institution? So I'm curious if you could speak about houses of worship, maybe either sort of your thoughts about working with the Jewish community, but also about houses of worship and the role that they may play in advancing your goals for our neighborhood and for Baltimore City in general.
So thank you for that question. It's a good question. I'm a Christian, but I ascribe to liberation theology. I think about equity and how we can do liberation through our faith and understanding and loving our neighbors and loving the humanity. This goes back to the conversation about humanity. And I think that our institutions who are recognizing humanity and investing in humanity are important in bolstering that. And I say continue to do your social justice work, because that social justice work can help not only Reservoir Hill, but the broader community. Or the fact that we have to think about the linkages. I have a friend of mine, Dr. Louise Fink, I call her my bubby. We have these conversations all the time because we think about the interfaith strength of the fact that we can use the connections of our congregates to advance the work that we so need in not only our organized beliefs, but in our organized communities. And I think that your congregates, I tell them to be empowering, be supportive of the community. And I tell people all the time, ask how. And this is one of the questions, how can I serve you? And I think that's one of the things I've learned from just thinking about liberation theology. It's about how can I serve my community? How can I serve you? How can I be humble and of you to help you?
Thank you for that, and you know, and also, of course, the flip side for that is you know, how do we also uphold the separation of church and state that exists in this country and that's enshrined in the First Amendment? And one of the things I think about is that the best way you get to religious freedom in a country is to make sure that the country does not sort of flirt too much with theocracy. And I mean, just reflecting on yesterday and what we saw and some of the horrifying images that we saw yesterday in the Capitol, that moment of watching people erect this giant cross on the grounds of the Capitol building, and sort of thinking about, like, that's what happens when people forget that there is no one state religion, right? That Christianity is a beautiful religion and Christians have every right to celebrate their Christianity, and Jews their Judaism, and Muslims their Islam, and Buddhists their, you know, their Buddhism. But you know, images don't belong in those sort of public spaces, and we have to be very careful about sort of the intersection. I don't know if you have thoughts about that. I just wanted to kind of reflect on that a little bit.
So I'm more of a separation between church and state. My religious beliefs should not impact you. I believe in a woman's right to choose. I tell people all the time that even in my household, when my wife and I we had complications on our pregnancy, thankfully our son is here safe. But the thing that we understood is that if I had to choose who left the hospital with me, it was going to be my wife. And just allowing people to have that choice, that agency, it's just basic to most of our religious doctrine. It's just understanding that people should have choices. And those choices should be governed by who you worship and how your moral code is. And the other question is I'm not in your conversation when you talk to God or your God, or if you're atheist, or you're talking to your rabbis, or you're theist. It's just thinking about it, is that I respect your right to worship, and that's where I'm at. I also understand is that not everything that is Judeo-Christian should be in law. I'm a firm believer there's a reason why you should talk about celebrating other people's holidays, understanding those principles. or understanding that there are multiple faiths that mention multiple prophets from each other's faith. Just being mindful and respectful of that. And that's one of the things I think about it. And I will tell you, my first thoughts of seeing that cross erected is wondering where they're going to burn it. It's the first question that came to mind. Or how ugly it was for a gentleman to be on camera with a Camp Auschwitz shirt in the chamber of Congress. Like, you were sitting in the rotunda yelling at reporters and the police with a Camp Auschwitz shirt.
Yeah, and I I don't know if you've ever read Eric K. Ward's piece "Skin in the Game," but I think he really he works for the Southern Poverty Law Center, black guy who went undercover in white supremacist organizations, and really kind of articulates the intersection of anti-Semitism and anti-black racism, and we saw that on full display yesterday at the Capitol in in that attempted pogrom, right? And I mean, I think it's fascinating that my reaction was, oh my God, a cross, and your reaction was, oh my God, they're going to light it on fire, and those two reactions are related. And I think understanding the relationship between that and the very possibility that that particular group could have done that, right? It could have gone either way, is exactly, I think, what's problematic about that particular group of domestic terrorists.
Or if we want to go deeper into it, thinking about this goes back to that police reform question. The reason why the Baltimore City Police Department is a state agency is the Civil War.
Right, the
In
no
Baltimore
party, right?
Yep, and also the fact that Baltimore was the first integrated city in this country during the Civil War, and the fact that, and then going into Reconstruction, there was a reason why the police department was that way, because at that time the police department was being used to bring back slaves that escaped from the Eastern Shore who were going to use the actual ports to go north. So, like, we have to think about the historic effects of white supremacy and where we are today. These decisions of where we are today have continually impacted us.
Well, one result is the the phenomenon of mass incarceration that you were referring to earlier, and returning citizens. And actually, let me turn to when we speak about congregations and what we might do as faith-based communities. I have a question from a Beth Am member, Judith, who says, Beth Am congregants have many talents. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how we might support returning citizens.
So one of the things I tell people is that in my spare time, I do a lot of expungement work. So if you are a person who has legal training and ability to help us expunge records, that is important because it gives a person another leg up. If you have an opportunity, go to Annapolis and tell them that we need to expand expungement and shielding. We need to make sure that persons cannot pull your criminal record unless it's related to your actual job. Because we can ban the box, but some people have left the box there, and if you don't check it or not, they're going to look. But also thinking about the fact that, like, if I never robbed a place, why are you as a banking institution looking into my criminal background?
Yeah. Let me do one more question from the chat, and then I may ask a question or two to wrap things up here. I'm really appreciative of your time this evening, Councilman. This is a question from Lindsay, who is a Beth Am member. Can you speak to meeting the massive amount of funding needed for the Kerwin Commission from the anemic city budget in light of COVID and state legislature that is historically not generous to our fair city? I know that's been a real concern right now, given the governor's actions, and I'm curious what you want to say about Kerwin and its path to successful implementation.
I want to say I'm thankful for the leadership of our delegation, Senator Ferguson, as well as the Delegate McIntosh, who got the bill lower than what it is, and to a point where we have to find it. Simply put, we have to find the funds, and we have to be meaningful about how we find those funds. But also the fact is that right now in the current financial forecast, will Carolyn be able to be enacted right away because of And from just looking at Standards and Poor's and others who are looking at the current state of the economy, we might have to go into a recession, which may delay Carolyn. So we have to still find ways to meaningfully do it. But also the fact is that Carolyn, a little small fact is that Carolyn's was attached to the Build to Learn Act for some funding for our schools. So imagine Douglas High School, which is in the 7th District, is a place that I'm slated and pushing for to make sure it gets renovated. It's a historic place right across the street from Mondawmin Mall. The trauma that's happened in that building, our students need to make sure, we need to make sure our students come to a building that's not only welcoming, but it seems who they are. So it's one of the things that's at the forefront of my mind, one, because of being an education advocate, but also understanding that I was educated in Baltimore City Public Schools and had to advocate for my own school building to be renovated. And that took place over 11 years ago. And that building still looks great now, but we have to make sure that we're addressing those needs.
Yeah, actually, let me ask a follow-up question about education, because one of the challenges we've had here in Reservoir Hill is when they did the 21st Century Schools project and happily began with Dorothy I. Heights School, and we're grateful for having a beautiful school facility in our neighborhood, but we lost our community rec center. And I remember Miss Cookie, I remember what a fundament of the neighborhood that recreation center was, a place for kids to go after school. And the promise was that the school would be a community anchor and a community resource center, so that basically the programmatic aspects of the rec center would find a home in the new community school. That really hasn't happened. There are elements. St. Francis has been able to use space in the school, but only during certain hours. There isn't the just kind of walk-in, drop-in atmosphere that used to be. And I'm wondering if you can help us unpack that a little bit and help us understand, how do we get to a place where we can actualize those promises, make good on the promises that were made, that Beth Am and St. Francis shouldn't be the only sort of neighborhood anchors, that the school should be a full anchor in this community. It's obviously an anchor, but it has become a more diminished one, unfortunately, despite the beautiful new building.
Yeah, so that goes back to those conversations about where we are in our resources. So one of the things is that I've been pushing for Rex and Parks is, how are we doing programming different? So how are we working with not only schools who are not near rec centers, and how we help them with helping that programming or providing after school programs. That's one of the things that I'm worried about, and one of the things that conversations I've started about how do we do it. And I'm looking forward to the briefings that we are expected to have in the coming months about it, because here's the thing. If it wasn't for the YMCA after school program, I wouldn't be James Torrence who I am today. I got the social emotional needs, but also the academic needs. I got a meal. I also got a chance to do chess. I got to do karate. I got to do dancing. I got to do basketball. I got to do youth and government program. Imagine the things that we can actually invest in our children. So that's one of the things that is the questions beyond just the youth fund, but it's more of programming in our recreation centers. I'm excited that other areas such as Cahill will be opening soon, which addresses the social emotional needs and programming for seniors as well as youth. And we're trying to expand it to other places, like addressing where there will be a new recreation center eventually in where Westside Elementary is. Or the fact that it's changing the programming within the park too, to amenable to Reservoir Hill and Penn North communities as well. So we're trying to think deeper and push people to think about where those resources coming from.
That's great. And once upon a time, there was actually a library branch in Reservoir Hill. So maybe you have thoughts about how we could have one again. It would be wonderful to have a library in the community, another great resource. Well, let me wrap things up. It's been just about an hour, and I've really enjoyed my conversation with you. I want to thank our partners again for their participation and their leadership in the community. Beth Am wouldn't be what we are without being able to be in relationship with our neighbors, both just our human neighbors and the organizational entities that surround us here in our community. We are going to have, God willing, one more session in this series of newly elected and so much to do. And that will be with Council President Nick Mosby. We're still finalizing the date for that program, so I will be in touch with folks, as will our partners, when we've solidified that date, and let you know when that's going to be. Obviously, the president has a lot in his new role, and we look forward to engaging him and being able to ask him about some of our concerns here in our community. Maybe I'll just conclude by asking you one final question, Councilman. And I feel like the question, what are you hopeful about, is trite, especially because it's almost as if when you ask a question like that, what you're really saying is, yeah, all that stuff that, we need to improve, but really, like, what's good. And in a way, I think that optimism can, if we're not careful, can be almost kind of weaponized against the real work of justice and to a certain extent of governance. Having said that, though, I really would love to hear something that gets you up in the morning. What is it that animates you? If you could choose one thing that you want to leave us with this evening, what is it that you're passionate about, that you want to make sure that we know about you and your role as our new city councilman?
So every morning I get up and I call my grandmother. It is one of the things I'm passionate about because and my routine in the morning is a little crazy. I'm up at 6, prayer, and then I call my grandmother, and then we talk about the news. And the reason why we talk about the news is she tells me everything that's just happened in Baltimore. So I try not to watch the news the night before so that we can have this conversation. But she reminds me of the love we have for community. And I'll say this, that I value those conversations because growing up, my grandmother stepped in when my mom was away. She became a guardian. She retired early when my mom died from cancer and took care of me and my sister. And I think about sacrifice or the selflessness of my grandmother. That's what emboldens and makes me passionate about the work that we do. It inspires me because I tell people all the time, I don't like spaghetti because it's something my grandmother made all the time because she gave so much to others growing up in public housing. But the one thing that she remained optimistic was that she saw in me things that I didn't see. She encouraged things in me that I didn't know could be possible. And I'm thankful for it. It's to the point where I keep a picture of my, even on my desk at City Hall and then in my office. It's a grandmother. And I say it because, interestingly enough, my grandmother married my grandfather, who came from a Black Jewish family. And so when I say that the deepness of faith in learning different faiths was quintessential to understanding that you can love people no matter what is behind the wrapper or beneath the layers of who they are. So for me, it's about being selfless and peeling the onion to make sure that we serve our community.
Councilman James Torrence of the 7th Councilmanic District, thank you very much for your time this evening. We appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you around the neighborhood.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.